Jaden Washington was just like any other 12-year-old boy in Laketon, a small American town that was unremarkable in many ways but rich in community spirit. The people here knew one another, and though life wasn't always easy for everyone, they looked out for each other when they could. Jaden lived with his mother, Alicia, who worked long hours at the local diner to provide for them. His father had passed away when Jaden was only 6, leaving a hole in their lives that was still felt deeply. Jaden's mum packed him a lunch every day, 2 sandwiches, an apple and a bottle of water. It wasn't fancy, but Alicia made sure he had enough to eat. "Food's fuel, baby," she'd say every morning, giving him a kiss on the forehead before sending him off to school. Jaden loved school, especially science class, and though he wasn't the most popular kid, he had a few good friends who stuck by him. One afternoon, Jaden sat down in the school cafeteria at his usual table with his friends Carlos and Malik. They all opened their lunch boxes, ready for another day of trading snacks and talking about video games. But across from them sat a boy Jaden recognized but had never really spoken to, Wesley. Wesley was sitting alone, and what caught Jaden's attention was the fact that Wesley had no lunch in front of him, just an empty lunch tray and his hands clasped together on the table. Wesley was new to the school, having moved to Laketon a few months earlier. He was quiet, kept to himself, and Jaden had overheard some of the kids teasing him in the hallway for wearing the same clothes several times a week. Jaden wasn't sure why Wesley didn't have a lunch that day, but something about the scene felt wrong to him. While the other kids were laughing and swapping chips, Wesley just stared at his tray, pretending he wasn't hungry. Without thinking much about it, Jaden reached into his lunchbox, took out one of his sandwiches and walked over to Wesley. "Hey man," Jaden said, holding out the sandwich. "Want this?" Wesley looked up, surprised and a little unsure. "Nah, I'm good," he said, but his eyes told a different story. "You sure?" Jaden asked. "I've got an extra. My mum always packs too much for me." This wasn't entirely true. Jaden's mum packed enough, but Jaden figured he could manage with just one sandwich for the day. He smiled and put the sandwich on Wesley's tray. Wesley hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Thanks," he mumbled quietly, unwrapping the sandwich and taking a small bite. Jaden returned to his table, and for the rest of lunch, he noticed Wesley looking a little more relaxed, even though they didn't talk much more that day. That night, as Jaden helped his mum clean up the dinner dishes, he thought about Wesley. He wondered why the boy didn't have lunch. Was his family going through something? Jaden had learned from his own experience with his father's passing that not everyone talked about their struggles, but that didn't mean they weren't going through hard times. He didn't tell his mum about giving away half his lunch, but he didn't regret it. The next day at school, Jaden sat down at the cafeteria table again, this time keeping an eye on Wesley. Sure enough, there he was, sitting alone again, with no lunch. Jaden sighed, opened his lunchbox and pulled out his sandwich. As he walked over to Wesley, he felt a little nervous. He didn't want Wesley to feel embarrassed or think Jaden was pitying him, but he also couldn't just sit there and do nothing. "Hey, you want half of this again?" Jaden asked, splitting his sandwich into 2 equal pieces. Wesley looked up, surprised to see Jaden again. "You don't have to, man," Wesley said, but the look of hunger in his eyes was clear. "I know I don't have to," Jaden replied, handing over half of his sandwich, "but I want to. Can't have you sitting here hungry." Wesley smiled this time, a real smile. "Thanks," he said, and the 2 boys ate their lunch in comfortable silence. Day after day, this became a routine. Jaden started bringing extra food, sometimes splitting his lunch with Wesley and sometimes sneaking snacks from home so he wouldn't go hungry himself. After a week, Malik and Carlos noticed what Jaden was doing. "Why are you always giving away your lunch, man?" Carlos asked one afternoon, eyeing the half sandwich Jaden had handed to Wesley. "Aren't you hungry?" Jaden shrugged. "It's no big deal. Wesley just doesn't have lunch, so I'm helping him out." Malik raised an eyebrow. "That's cool and all, but what if you run out of food?" You gotta eat too, you know." "I'll be fine," Jaden replied, but truthfully he had started feeling a little hungrier than usual. He hadn't told his mum about what he was doing, but he didn't want her worrying about him either, so he kept splitting his lunch, even though it meant going without a full meal some days. As the weeks passed, Jaden noticed that Wesley wasn't the only kid in the cafeteria who seemed to go without lunch. There were a few others, kids who sat at the far ends of the room, quietly keeping to themselves with empty trays in front of them. Jaden's heart ached as he realized just how many of his classmates didn't have enough to eat. It wasn't something people talked about much, but he knew some of these kids' families struggled to make ends meet. Jaden couldn't stop thinking about it. Every day he saw more kids with no lunches and more empty trays, and every day he wished he could do more. One sandwich wasn't enough for everyone. One night, after a particularly long day at school, Jaden sat at the dinner table with his mum. As they ate, he couldn't stop thinking about the kids at school who didn't have lunches. Finally, he looked up at his mum and blurted out, "Mum, what if we started something to help kids who don't have lunch at school?" Alicia looked at her son, surprised. "What do you mean, Jaden? What's going on?" Jaden hesitated, but then he explained everything. How Wesley hadn't had lunch for weeks, how he'd been sharing his food, and how there were other kids at school who seemed to be going without meals too. I don't know. I've been sharing my lunch, but it's not enough. I want to help more, but I don't know how." Alicia sat back in her chair, thinking. She knew times were tough for a lot of families in Laketon, especially with jobs being scarce and the economy still struggling, but she hadn't realized it was affecting kids at school so directly. "You've got a big heart, Jaden," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "It's good that you want to help, but you can't do it all on your own. Maybe there's something we can do together." Jaden's eyes lit up. "Like what?" "Well," Alicia said, "why don't we start by talking to the school? Maybe we can set up something, like a lunch-sharing program or a way to get extra food for kids who need it." The next day, Alicia called the school to arrange a meeting with the principal, Mrs. Daniels. Jaden was nervous when they walked into her office, but his mum was right there beside him. Mrs. Daniels listened carefully as Jaden explained what he had been doing and why he wanted to help more kids. When he finished, she smiled warmly. "Jaden, what you've been doing is wonderful," she said. "I'm really impressed by your kindness and your willingness to help your classmates. I've noticed that some of our students are struggling, and I think you're right, we need to do something about it." Together they came up with a plan. The school would start a lunch-sharing program where students could donate extra food and families who needed help could sign up to receive meals. They would also work with local grocery stores and restaurants to get donations. "I'll talk to some of the parents too," Mrs. Daniels said. "I'm sure many of them will be happy to help." Jaden couldn't believe it. His idea was actually happening. As he walked out of the principal's office with his mum, he felt a surge of excitement. This was just the beginning. Within a few weeks, the lunch-sharing program was up and running. Mrs. Daniels sent home flyers to all the parents explaining the new initiative, and many families donated extra food. The cafeteria set up a special table where kids who didn't have lunch could come and get something to eat without having to feel embarrassed. Jaden and his friends, Malik and Carlos, took it a step further. They started a club, the Lunch Sharing Club, where they encouraged their classmates to bring in extra snacks or lunches to help out. The club wasn't just about food, though. It was about making sure that no one felt left out or ashamed if they needed help. Wesley, the boy who had first inspired Jaden to take action, joined the club too. He was quieter than the others, but Jaden could tell he was grateful. Slowly, more kids started coming to the lunch table, some to donate, others to receive, but all of them feeling a little more connected to one another. As the club grew, so did the impact. Local businesses heard about the program and began donating food. The diner where Alicia worked even started providing sandwiches once a week, and the local grocery store sent boxes of fresh fruit for the kids. The program was a success, and Jaden's heart swelled with pride every time he saw one of his classmates getting a lunch when they might have otherwise gone without. But more than that, he saw the way people started to come together. Kids who had never talked to each other before were sitting together at lunch, sharing food and stories. There was a new sense of community in the cafeteria, and it was all because a few people had decided to help. Not everyone was happy with the changes, though. Some kids teased the members of the lunch-sharing club, calling them names or making fun of the kids who didn't have food. One day, as Jaden walked to his locker after lunch, he overheard a group of boys snickering. "Look, there goes the lunch hero," one of them said, mocking Jaden. Jaden felt his stomach drop, but he didn't say anything. He had always tried to avoid trouble at school, but it was hard not to feel hurt by their words. That night, when he got home, he told his mum about what had happened. Alicia listened carefully, then gave him a hug. "You're doing the right thing, Jaden," she said. "Not everyone is going to understand, but that doesn't mean you should stop. You're helping people, and that's what matters." Her words gave Jaden the strength to keep going. The next day, he walked into school with his head held high. He knew there would always be people who didn't understand, but he wasn't doing this for them. He was doing it for Wesley, for the kids who didn't have enough, and for the community he wanted to build. As the weeks went by, the teasing stopped, and more kids started supporting the lunch-sharing program. Even the boys who had made fun of Jaden at first began to come around, offering to help out with organising the donations. By the end of the school year, the lunch-sharing program had grown beyond anything Jaden could have imagined. What had started as one boy sharing his sandwich with a hungry classmate had turned into a movement. The local news even did a story about the program, highlighting how one small idea had made such a big difference in the lives of so many kids. The cafeteria was no longer a place where kids sat alone with empty trays. It was a place where everyone was welcome, where food was shared, and where kindness and generosity was celebrated. At the end of the year, Mrs. Daniels called Jaden to her office once again. This time she handed him a small plaque that read, "Laketon Elementary Community Service Award, presented to Jaden Washington for his leadership and compassion." Jaden looked at the plaque, feeling a lump in his throat. He had never expected any recognition for what he had done. He had just wanted to help. "You deserve this, Jaden," Mrs. Daniels said. "What you've done here is truly special. You've made a real difference in the lives of your classmates." Jaden smiled, feeling both proud and humbled. He knew that none of this would have been possible without the help of his friends, his mum, and the community that had rallied around the idea. As he walked home that day, Jaden thought about how much had changed in just a few months. The teasing, the hunger, the loneliness, it had all been replaced by something stronger, a sense of belonging, of shared responsibility, of community. That summer, the lunch-sharing program expanded to the middle school, and Jaden became known as the boy who started it all. But to him, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about doing what was right. Wesley, the boy who had once sat alone in the cafeteria with no lunch, had become one of Jaden's closest friends. They spent the summer hanging out, playing basketball, and making plans for how they could keep the lunch-sharing program going in the fall. And as they sat together on a sunny afternoon, Jaden realized something important. It wasn't just about food. It was about kindness, about standing up for each other, and about making sure no one was left behind. Jaden knew that he couldn't solve all the problems in the world, but in his small town of Laketon, he had learned that even the smallest act of kindness could spark something bigger, something that could change lives, build communities, and make the world just a little bit better. As he and Wesley walked home that day, Jaden smiled to himself. He didn't need to be a hero. He just needed to keep doing what he had always done, share what he had, help where he could, and make sure no one was left out. Because in the end, it wasn't about the sandwich. It was about the heart behind it. And Jaden knew his heart was in the right place.